Chapter 2. The Mystery Begins.
Some months later, as the curtain fell on the evening's performance, 6 frightened ballerinas rushed breathlessly into the dressing room of Annie Sorelli, the principal dancer. The youngest, Meg Giry, was squealing.
The Phantom! We saw him!
Everyone had heard stories about the Phantom, but the level-headed Sorelli had always dismissed them as mere superstition.
Madame, we really saw him. He was with a Persian.
Now, Sorelli had to struggle to stay calm. The Persian was a dark, mysterious man with deep green eyes that seemed to pierce the very soul of anyone who met his gaze. No one knew his name. No one knew what he did. The only thing anyone knew for certain was that he was always somewhere in the opera, startling people by appearing and disappearing at odd times, usually when someone thought they had seen the Phantom. As the young dancers fluttered about, chattering on and on about the incident,
So awful.
a tall, dark figure slipped past the crowd and vanished out of sight, his black cloak hiding him in the shadows backstage. Sorelli pulled herself together.
You're acting like a silly goose, Meg. There is no Phantom.
Meg, with hands on her hips, answered back crossly.
Well, if he's not a phantom, he certainly looks like one. Just like Monsieur Bouquet said. He was as thin as a rake, with eyes so deep in his face they looked like black holes, and a face that didn't even seem human. His skin was pale and grey, and his nose was so small it almost wasn't there. And there was not one hair on his head.
Joseph Bouquet was the chief scene changer and, like Sorelli, a calm and sensible person who would not make up stories about seeing the Phantom. So, those who believed in the Phantom took him seriously. Those who did not thought someone had just played a joke on him. One thing was certain. There were now 6 more witnesses who had seen this terrifying creature. Sorelli, however, insisted.
My dears, pull yourselves together.
Excitedly, little Meg told the dancers,
My mother says the Phantom doesn't like people talking about him, and when they do, terrible things happen.
And how does your mother know what he does and doesn't like?
Well,
the other dancers leaned closer to hear.
he talks to her.
Oh, Meg, stop it.
Sorelli was annoyed.
In box 5 to the left of the stage. Mama looks after that box and she knows.
The others looked at her in horror.
It's true. Others have seen him there too. He wears a long black evening cloak and a white mask that covers most of his face and...
At that moment, they heard a woman's voice screaming frantically. It was Meg's mother, Madame Giry, a short, plump woman whose clothes looked as though they had once belonged to someone else. She was usually chatty and friendly, but now she appeared deathly white with shock.
Monsieur Bouquet is dead. They found him lying in the 3rd cellar with rope marks on his neck. He's hanged himself.
Sorelli, too, went white with shock. Monsieur Bouquet was a reasonable man, and she could not imagine what might have made him take his own life. She and the other dancers looked at each other with the same awful words on their lips. The Phantom. Suddenly, in spite of the disorder backstage, Sorelli noticed the Count Philippe de Chagny, a Parisian nobleman and patron of the opera. He was accompanied by his younger brother, the Viscount Raoul de Chagny, a young blonde-haired, blue-eyed man with a neatly trimmed moustache who attracted the attention of women wherever he went.
Count de Chagny, how delightful to see you.
Madame, what a wonderful evening! As always, your dancing was superb, and I must say I had no idea the opera had such a great talent as Christine Daae. She sang so beautifully tonight.
When Meg Giry heard this, she hid a frown and muttered,
If only he'd heard her 6 months ago. She could barely sing a note then.
Meg was close to the truth. Christine Daae had not been well received by the hard-to-please Parisian opera audience. The death of her father when she was younger had robbed her of her inspiration, and her performances lacked their former energy. But recently her voice had developed exquisitely. Tonight she had stood in for Carlotta, the Spanish diva who had been taken ill, and she sang like an angel as the lead in the evening's performance. It did seem strange that someone who was untrained only months ago could now be so gifted. Some would call it unbelievable. What was her secret? Everyone wondered. The handsome young Viscount Raoul went to Christine's dressing room immediately after the performance. The room was full of people congratulating her on her wonderful singing. She was polite and gracious, a real beauty with clear blue eyes and smooth white skin. She was laughing and talking with her guests, but when she turned and saw Raoul, she became noticeably uneasy. As their eyes met, Raoul bowed and kissed her hand.
We meet again, Christine. Don't you remember the little boy you knew so many years ago? Don't you remember when I ran into the sea to get your scarf for you?
Christine only looked away, as though she hadn't recognized him, and went on to greet her other admirers.
Monsieur Junot, how nice to
Raoul's
see you.
face saddened. He couldn't have imagined that she might forget him. He desperately wanted to speak to her alone, so he waited outside her dressing room until everyone else had left. Just as he was about to knock on her door, he heard a voice inside, a man's voice.
Christine, your voice was as sweet as honey tonight.
I promised to sing only for you, and I have. I gave you my soul.
You have a beautiful soul, my dear, and I am grateful. Be sure you are ready for tomorrow.
Yes, of course. I'll be waiting.
Raoul's heart filled with jealousy. Who was this other man? He hid in the passage and waited for him to leave. When the door opened and Christine left alone without locking it behind her, Raoul crept back inside. He could see nothing in the darkness and called out,
Who's there?
When there was no reply, he persisted.
You won't leave this room, sir, until you identify yourself.
Raoul lit the gaslight and looked around, but the room was completely empty. He opened all the wardrobes. He found nothing. There were no windows in the room. The man had vanished into thin air. Hurt by Christine's rejection and confused by the disappearance of this other man, Raoul finally left the dressing room and the opera. Riding home in his carriage, the same thought echoed in his head.
Who was that man?